I'm Jason Lewis.
I'm Flora Gladwin.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a group of concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. Well, with several months between our recent releases, some of our loyal listeners may be wondering what's happening with the podcast. Fair question. Since this last year, we've been investing more of our energy into advancing climate actions at more of a local level. And while we're super excited about this work, we are committed to continuing to release podcasts, but more on a quarterly cycle going forward, at least for the near future. If you're interested in learning more about our local work or more about the podcast, drop us a line on our website, climateoptimist.co. And with that, I'll turn it over to Flora to talk about today's topic.
Thanks, Jason. So, over the past year, we've watched power demand soar with increased electrification, population growth, and the boom of big data centers that fuel AI. And amid all this increased demand, we've seen the US's current administration back off of climate goals and work to increase fossil fuel use. But despite the US's best efforts to slow clean energy, China is forging on ahead. In fact, China has become the world's largest consumer, producer, and investor in renewables. The country reached its 2030 target for renewable energy capacity 6 years ahead of schedule. So
Awesome.
Personally, we wanted to learn more. Like, how is climate change directly impacting China? How has the country contributed to renewables at the global scale? And what is the government doing to set and achieve new climate targets? But before we go there, let's turn to Thomas for this week's Reason for Hope.
Thanks, Flora. In other good news from Asia, in the first half of this year, Japan generated more electricity from carbon-free sources than it has over the last decade. And while that's still down from 2011 when the country cut nuclear production in the wake of the Fukushima meltdown, it's still progress. And solar has been the big success story. It's grown fivefold just in the past decade and now makes up 10% of the electricity supply. Nuclear generation has also been increasing as the country restarts those older facilities as part of its green transformation policy. And hopefully the growth of this clean energy sector in Japan will cause concern for fossil fuel exporters like Australia. As they've relied heavily, Australia's relied heavily on the growth of Japan's fossil fuel demand in the last decade or so.
Yeah, I was excited to read that article. It's nice to see that, Japan is finally, picking up some slack. They were a bit of a laggard when it came to clean energy for a long time. And so it's nice to see them leaning in on solar and, restarting some of those old nuclear facilities so that we can wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. And yeah, nothing I'd love more than to see more fossil fuel exporters be scrambling to find other places to sell their product. Well, with that, let's introduce today's guest. Yuhe Gao is project manager for the Low Carbon Development Policy Project in Greenpeace East Asia. She has over 8 years' experience with renowned environmental organizations that include Natural Resources Defense Council, the Environmental Defense Fund, and World Wildlife Fund. Her expertise kind of spans climate change, energy transition, green finance, and environmental and social risk assessment. Her work at Greenpeace focuses on advancing China's low-carbon electricity policies and promoting quality renewable energy development. She also actively supports strengthening climate diplomacy and energy transition collaboration between China and European countries, which is all the more important given the current U.S. situation. Yuhe, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Hello, Jason.
Let's start you out with the first question we do all our guests. When it comes to efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful?
Well, personally, I think there are two critical and historical moments that makes me very hopeful. One is in September 2020. President Xi brought about China's commitment to the world that China will achieve carbon emission peak by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. And the other one I really want to mention is China and EU's joint climate leadership. As you know, China and the EU made a joint statement to address climate change, which has not only addressed their climate leadership role, but has also given more hope to encourage other countries to fulfill their climate commitments. And I think this joint statement is quite significant. It was released by China and EU to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations. And it is also the recognition of the 10th anniversary of the adoption of Paris Agreement.
That is exciting. I think it's nice to see that things are progressing with other countries, and to hear China and the EU sort of reiterating their commitment to address emissions. I think that's fantastic. Well, for guests who, might not be as close to China, wondering if we can kind of start out and, I just ask you to kind of describe how China's being impacted today by climate change.
Sure. I think, first of all, on a political level, since China has proposed its climate commitment, China's central government has already prioritized climate change as one of its top agenda items. And the government has highlighted the significance of developing new quality productive forces. And it is a new term, but it's also very important, promoted by China as today's key economic strategy. It means that China's economic growth will shift from traditional growth model towards innovation-driven, green, and high-value development. And both central and local government have put a lot of efforts into developing these green and low carbon industries, such as electronic vehicles, solar PV, and battery energy storage. And today, you can see that China has already become the largest renewable energy investor, supplier, and consumer in the world. And on the local level, however, we can also witness that China is facing all kinds of climate risks and challenges. For instance, extreme weather has caused more loss and disasters in recent years. And in this summer, floods have occurred more frequently in China, affecting both cities and villages. Especially 2 weeks ago, even in Beijing, also suffered very severe floods triggered by heavy rainstorms. This tragic disaster caused 44 fatalities, unfortunately.
Oh, wow. It's hard to see these climate impacts as they become more significant, but I think it's good for, people to have the context. And, China's obviously a big country, and, it's going to be heavily impacted as well when it comes to the climate. But it's great to hear. And I've done a fair amount of reading myself that China is really leaning into becoming, the leader when it comes to, producing these technologies of the future, like, solar panels that you mentioned, obviously batteries, electric vehicles. Well, you've mentioned, I think, a little bit already, but maybe we talk just briefly about, China's kind of climate targets and how it's progressing towards achieving them.
As I mentioned before, China has proposed its dual carbon target, which is carbon peak by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. With the rapid growth of China's renewable energy, China's total capacity of wind and solar has surpassed 1,200 gigawatts, which shows that China has met its 2030 targets of renewable energy capacity 6 years ahead of schedule. And this also means that China has great potential to play a pioneer role as a climate leader. And China really needs to raise up its climate ambition and submit a more ambitious NDC, National Determined Contribution target, as soon as possible for this upcoming COP30.
That's right. Folks may not know, but we have the annual, climate conference, international climate conference that's going to take place in Brazil later this year. And as you mentioned, I think all countries are supposed to submit new sort of national targets. Well, in terms of emissions, I mean, it sounds like China's making good progress, obviously, in, expanding renewable energy. But let's talk a little bit about China's largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, sort of where they come from.
Yeah, that's a very important question. And electricity, or we can call it power sector, it accounts for nearly 40% of China's carbon emission as the largest sources. Yeah. as a largest source. Yeah.
And after electricity, is transportation kind of the number two?
Right. Yeah. Electricity is a top one. And the second one is transportation. And then is the architecture.
Buildings.
Yeah.
So, given that China's largest source of emissions is sort of, as you said, the power sector, what measures has it, been implementing, obviously, aside from, installing a lot of clean energy capacity? What kind of measures has it implemented to encourage that? And how would you say these measures are working?
Yeah, actually, 2 years ago, China's National Energy Administration, NEA, released China's strategy to build up a new type of electricity system. Why we call that is new? Because it will be mainly supported by renewable energy. And this can be regarded as the most important top level policy framework, which aims to transform China's power system from a coal power based system to a clean energy one. And although China has put forward its clean power ambition, we need to know that coal power still accounts for 60% of China's electricity system today. The good news is we have witnessed a very quite positive trend this year. By the end of March this year, a total capacity of China's wind and solar power has surpassed the thermal power for the first time. More importantly, the total power generation from renewable energy has exceeded China's total electricity demand in the first quarter of this year. This also proved that China's power sector is more likely to achieve its carbon peak by the end of 2025. And China will not need to build up more coal power plants to meet its newly increased electricity demand. In fact, we have noticed that in 2024, the growth rate of coal power generation began to slow down already and even declined during certain periods.
Well, that's great news. And it sounds like, you mentioned a key point there that not only are renewables, making up a larger share, and sounds like in terms of generation is set to overtake thermal or coal and natural gas. But you also talked about it being able to meet the increasing, demand in electricity, which I think is a key part. I'm wondering, in terms of how China plans to transition away from, fill basically coal with renewables. Like, is the vision to, have wind and solar plus batteries? Is it to have wind, solar, batteries, and, like nuclear and hydro?
I think, first of all, as I have already mentioned, that for the top policy framework, and China has clearly put forward its goal is to transform China's power system from a coal power based one to a clean energy one. And in order to achieve this goal, the most important thing is for the power system itself to be more flexible and to adjust renewable energy integration. And I think this is the key, and it can also be the key barrier for China, because previously the power system, especially for the power grids, is made for coal power, not made for renewable energy. But
Right.
today, it really needs to change its role, because renewable energy needs to take more base load role to replace coal power in the future. And secondly, and China also need to accelerate its power market establishment, not only to integrate more renewable energy, but also give more market opportunities for energy storage like batteries. If we have a more effective power market, and that will give more opportunities for renewable energy naturally.
If I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like China is in the process of sort of redesigning its power market to create behaviors that would allow clean energy to take on a bigger role.
Yeah. China's NEA has already released a new document that is quite important. We call that a 136, number 136 document. It shows that starting from this year, all of the renewable energy in China will go to the power market to compete with each other and with other type of resources. previously, for a solar investor, as long as you install your PV and you can earn quite certain amount of money, and so your profits will be guaranteed. But in the future, especially from this year, and the investment model will be totally changed. So we just hope that next year or by the end of this year, policy mechanism released by the local governments can be more friendly for renewable energy.
So in other words, the plan is to, move the market to one that's more sort of, call it fully integrated, functioning without the tariff. But it sounds like the central government is giving local governments a little bit of decision-making power in terms of how to make that transition.
Exactly, right. Yeah.
European listeners or listeners in the US are used to kind of policy being created on, certain cycles. Can you talk at a high level? I mean, it sounds like you have different kinds of planning cycles in China. Is it a 5-year plan?
Yeah, so for China, the top political level is the 5 years plan, as you mentioned. Yeah, so for the next 5-year plan, we'll start from 2026. So why we also think that 2025 is quite important, because this is the last year of China's 14th 5-year plan, and starting from next year, there will be a new phase of China's 5-year plan. That will be the 15th 5-year plan. That's why we also believe that China's power sector should really grasp this opportunity to achieve its carbon peak by the end of this year. That will also set a right direction for China's energy transition for the next 5-year plan.
Yeah, that'd be very exciting, I think, for all of us. It's hard sometimes. You feel like there maybe isn't a lot of good news when it comes to climate, and certainly if China's able to, have its emissions peak 5 years early, that's a huge benefit.
Right. Of course, China needs to, as the largest carbon emitter in the world, China needs to achieve its early carbon peak as soon as possible. That will give more opportunities and hope to other countries.
Yeah, that's a good point. Seeing China, not only meet but beat its targets, I think puts additional pressure on other nations to take more aggressive measures. So we've covered a lot of good ground here. I'm wondering, is there anything I haven't asked you that that might be interesting for people to know about China's energy transition?
I still want to highlight one point, that is, although China's renewable energy has growing very rapidly this years, China's government is still keeping approving new coal power projects. And we also heard from some China's energy experts say that China's coal power projects will still be approved, and China still need to build up more new coal for the next 5 years. So how will that be? We really need to see the government set a clear signal for that. Although power sector can achieve its carbon peak, but after carbon peak, China still need to accelerate its steps to achieve its carbon neutrality. That is the second target. Yeah, so for the coal, it can still be the biggest barrier for China. Yeah, I just want to highlight this to make you understand.
No, it's a great point. Not only obviously is coal still a very significant part of China's energy mix or power mix, but it sounds like that you still are seeing those approvals happen, and it sounds like you're hopeful that with Greenpeace pushing that the government is able to have a year here soon where they basically stop approving new coal plants.
Yeah, we really want to see the coal power that being approved will be declined, but we are not so sure about that. Yeah, we will see the final result by the end of this year, and I will also keep you updated.
Well, Yuhe covered a lot of ground. It's definitely exciting to see the progress that China's making. Obviously, additional measures that need to be taken to get China to net zero, but still a positive sign to see these discussions, see all the progress. Just wanted to say thanks for all your great work at Greenpeace, and we hope you're successful in your campaign to get China to phase out building new coal plants and start that transition downward.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I really enjoyed the interview with Yuhe. Tons of information there. And I learned a lot about how, China's energy policy, gets shaped and how things are playing out on the ground. I do feel like it was a lot of information naturally. And so maybe the first place to start is just to summarize a little bit. I mean, I know, Flora, as you mentioned in the intro, China's achieved its clean energy target 6 years early. Just to kind of provide a sense of scale of the transformation. Got some 2024 data here from Ember. They produced 40% of their electricity from, non-carbon sources last year. They installed more wind and solar than the rest of the world combined, if you can believe that. And because of that, record installation, they also were able to meet, roughly 80% of their new electricity demand, which is huge because, once you're meeting all of your new demand, that enables you to start decreasing, the amount of fossil fuels that you're producing. So truly massive change. And, obviously really positive implications. The power sector emissions, as Yuhei mentioned, are potentially peaking this year. In addition, we're also seeing, energy policy adjustments. They're starting to provide what are called capacity payments to coal facilities because there's a recognition they don't need to produce at full capacity anymore, but they want to keep that, there for those days or those long stretches when there's, say a big storm coming through or what have you, where, the supply of clean energy isn't normally what it would be to cover those gaps. But there is this recognition that, they're just not going to be relying on coal as much as they were in the past.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. That was also after the interview kind of what I wanted to dig into at first, was some of those kind of different pieces of policy, just because I feel like China has done a really good job of supporting this transition. And so I looked a little bit more into the 136 document that we spoke about in the interview. And I guess I just wanted to get a better feel for how it works, what exactly it's doing. And so from my understanding, the document confronts what Yuhei noted was one of China's biggest challenges, which is how to effectively integrate renewables. Renewable power will now be sold on the market. So the document includes a few protections for generators. For example, to reduce volatility, China's establishing a predetermined price for renewables called the SMP, or Sustainable Market Price. So essentially, if the market pays more, generators owe the grid, and if the market pays less, the grid owes generators. A lot of this policy that's been outlined in Document 136 was actually borrowed from Germany and a little bit from the UK and their decarbonization plans, which I think is really fascinating. And yeah, in general, I just think this document is really huge. China isn't just talking the talk; they're really making a point to walk the walk.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Flora. I think historically we've been very critical of China, knowing it's the world's largest source of emissions. That they burn half the world's coal, and while those two things are true, I think we do really have to give credit in terms of the massive undertaking of shifting their entire electricity supply over to renewables and how quickly they've been able to do that. So definitely positive to see, especially in light of what's going on in the U.S. right now.
Well, look, Jason, I think to pile on your point there, I find amazing the fact that China has managed to decarbonize its economy, but at the same time, they've done all the manufacturing for the solar panels and the batteries and the electric vehicles used in the majority of the rest of the world. So,
Right.
like, I take Australia's manufacturing back 20 years ago, it made up 11% of the GDP in Australia. Now it's down to 5%. What have we done with those emissions? We've offshored those emissions. The manufacturing of all the goods we consume has just been shifted over to China. So that's a huge burden on them. I mean, you take the coal, for example, that we export to China and Japan and Korea. The emissions of that coal don't count against Australia. The only emissions that count against Australia are the extraction emissions from that, digging it out of the ground, putting it on a train and sending it down to the port. The emissions that are associated with the combustion of it and the production of the goods that we then import, that burden sits on the country that manufactures those goods. So that's what makes this even more mind-blowingly amazing, that they've managed to achieve this and make everything else for us at the same time.
Very good point, Thomas. I mean, looking at China's transformation here, until you really, dig deeper, you don't appreciate the magnitude of it and the many facets it has.
The other thing that really struck me about China was how they have set up their economy to able to be easily decarbonized. Right? China has gone very hard to electrify their economy. I take the global financial crisis back in 2008. I was actually over there. Were you with us, Lewis? We went and had a look at the manufacturing plant in Tianjin.
It's weird you guys didn't invite me, but
No, I didn't. I missed that tour.
Okay, so it was to make turbines to sell to America. They never sold any to America. They were all being used for the demand that had started to develop within China. At the same time, in 2008, when the economy started to get a little bit shaky, Chinese government said, right, what we're going to do is roll out a plan to build intercity rail between all the major centers in China, right? This has done amazing things for China to decarbonize its society because they're not dependent upon air travel. There's virtually no domestic flights. People are taking rail, which was predominantly set up to be electric out of the gate, so far easier to decarbonize than jet travel, which is going to be one of the hardest things, one of the last things.
I mean, I think it's also worth calling out too that we can tell not just by the numbers that this global transformation is picking up huge steam, also because of the attention it's garnered from the fossil fuel industry, right? So as renewables have been expanding exponentially, the fossil fuel industry has just ramped up its attacks to try to slow the transition. They spent $219 million on the U.S. election the last cycle.
Ugh.
And they've started to even sue their opponents to try to silence folks.
Yeah, and I think this squabbling has, I mean, it's basically handed China the lead. I mean, for the last few years, China has had this export tax rebate on renewables, batteries, etc. So when they sell a solar panel, there was a 13% tax rebate on that solar panel. So essentially, the Chinese government has been subsidizing solar panel distribution throughout the rest of the world. China has now, there's basically no competition globally. All the major solar panel manufacturers in the world come out of China. So the Chinese government is now rolling back this incentive because they've won, right? And they're doing the same thing with batteries, a similar thing with electric vehicles.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Thomas. Not only has China really been laying the groundwork at home for this road to decarbonization, but they've also clearly used this moment to step up as a global leader in renewables. And that being said, Yuhe really spoke to the NDC, or Nationally Determined Contribution. NDCs are essentially a country's climate commitment to the world. And this is really visible and obvious as China's president, when introducing the potential next NDC, made a point to defend the Paris Agreement. So as it is, the current NDC only covers carbon emissions from the energy sector.
That's right.
And according to the Climate Action Tracker, which is a great tool that we've referenced before, China is currently off track for its targets to reduce carbon emission intensity. So there's definitely a lot of work still to be done. However, the president has already announced the fact that the new target is going to include all greenhouse gas emissions, meaning methane, HFCs. So he's really taking advantage of this moment to make a pretty big statement on the global stage. And it's going to be really interesting to read more about that NDC when it's out and see what it's going to do.
Yeah, it's exciting to know that they're stepping up in this, sort of vacuum that the U.S. has created by stepping away on climate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with that, let's get to what you can do as a listener. As we discussed earlier, we're seeing really ramped up attacks by the fossil fuel industry to try to slow the transition.
Mm-hmm.
And nowhere is that more evident than, here in the US with the Trump administration. Given that, we need all of us to get involved in some way. And the first way you can do that is by calling on your elected officials to push back against attacks on clean energy. Within the US, most new energy siting decisions are still made at a state and local level. And so given that, it's critical that our representatives hear from all of us. Just a simple call or email asking them to do more to support our clean energy transition can make a real difference.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a really great way to get involved. And our second option is to join an organization that's helping to address climate change. And so I think the obvious one here after that really productive interview is Greenpeace, that's not only doing a lot of really great work within the US, but abroad. And there's plenty of other organizations that, especially right now, could use people's help, particularly in the US.
Yeah, it's a great time to get involved. The reality is action is that, antidote to despair. When you get involved and start making a difference, you feel better about the current state of affairs. So yeah, great call out, Flora. Any final thoughts from you, Thomas?
Another organization I've been thinking of is your local bike transportation alliance.
Ooh, nice.
One of the biggest factors in the US and Australia is we need to decarbonize the transportation sector. It's typically about 25% of our emissions, so it's an easy one to take care of with 2 wheels instead of 4.
Great point. Yeah, so we got options globally, options locally. Definitely plenty of ways to get involved. Find the one that calls most to you. Well, that's all for this episode. Thanks as always for tuning in. And as a reminder, if you're interested in learning more about our local efforts here in the Portland area to drive climate action, drop us a line on our website, climateoptimist.co.